About halfway through William Carey's ministry, a young couple named Adoniram and Ann Judson would also set sail for India, hoping to join them in the mission. However, yes, they were harassed by the East India Company, and that would cause them to leave India. So they set sail for another country across the bay, this time a place called Burma. Today we call it Myanmar, but in those days it was called Burma. And so one of my goals today is to show you that Burma has more to offer than just the Burmese python and Rambo. So Adoniram Judson's life goal in Burma was to translate one copy of a complete Bible into Burmese, as well as found one church that had 100 members by the time of his death. All right, that was his goal. One church, 100 members. That's the goal of my life, and a Bible in the language. So let's start off with the positives like I did last week. I want to tell you all that he accomplished at the end of his life. Adoniram Judson did, in fact, complete a Burmese Bible, which still today is the most commonly used translation in Myanmar, which is now 200 years later. Other translations have been made, but the local people of Myanmar prefer Judson's translation because they say it captures some of the local flavor, the idioms and the phrases that are lost. They like his, even still today. I think that's really cool. At the time of his death, there were 100 churches that he knew of and 8,000 believers that he could count. A lot more than he set out to do. Today, Myanmar ranks in the top 10 countries in the world in the number of identifying Baptists. I've seen it as high as third on some charts. That's amazing. That is amazing. Each July in Myanmar, churches celebrate Judson Day to commemorate the arrival of the missionary that brought them the gospel. How cool is that? Adoniram Judson planted a seed into some seriously rocky soil, among thorns also to do that. And nevertheless, he tilled and plowed and watered and planted. By God's grace, he was able to see some of the fruit before he passed on. But even the tree that stands today is much greater than what he ever expected would happen. It grew after he died. And so the great harvest, though, did not come without hardship, and that's what I want to share with you a little bit today. So Adoniram Judson was born in 1788 in the great state of Massachusetts. Any Massachusetts people here? No? All right, just checking. In the home of a Congregationalist pastor. So that was the denomination he was born into, Congregationalist. From an early age, he was really sharp. He was accepted into Brown University at age 16. And though he lived in a pastor's home, he wasn't particularly spiritual. It wasn't like he was a Spurgeon child prodigy that was preaching at age 8. No, that was not Adoniram Judson. He heard some deistic views in college that made him sort of stray a bit. And he went to even New York City to sort of get away from it all and try to become a playwright. So he was not deep into his faith in his college years. Kind of a turning point for him. One night as he was traveling around, he heard in his hotel next door, in the room next door to him, some strange noises, and he thought, maybe I should check that out. And then he didn't, and morning came and someone had died on the other side of the room, and he sort of went through this blaming himself period of, I should have checked on it, I should have gone over there. And so sort of in this phase, he went back home, and he was talking to his dad, and his dad was a pastor and starting a seminary called Andover Seminary. And though Adoniram could not in good conscience sign the faith pledge to say, I am a believer, I can go to the seminary, he could not do that, but his dad accepted him as a special case to the seminary. And so it was there at this seminary, taking classes and learning, that Adoniram Judson came to faith. In 1808, that's when he was saved. And so at this seminary, he began to read missionary biographies and great stories of those that had gone before him. And he thought, maybe I could be called to this. And this was unique because at the time, I mean, we think of America as sending missionaries, but this was before that really got going. America was barely, I mean, they weren't even officially a country at that point yet in that time. And so I guess in 1808 they were, but not at the time of his birth. There just wasn't a lot being sent from America. And so he met a young lady by the name of Anne Hasseltine. I can't get chocolate beverage, rich chocolate Ovaltine out of my mind when I hear that name. But Adoniram met a woman named Anne Hasseltine. She was a strong believer. And contrasting with last week's story, this was not a woman that he had to drag overseas with him, kicking and screaming. No, actually, Anne had her own conviction to mission work before she met Adoniram. And she even said that she would not have married him had he not also been called to missions. And so she wanted this to be very clear. I love this quote that I found. She said her call to overseas missions was not prompted by an attachment to an earthly object. That was Adoniram, by the way, that earthly object. But because of an obligation to God and a full conviction of his call. So she's very clear. I'm not going because he's going. This isn't because he drugged me here. I want to do this too. And so in 1812, she and Adoniram were married. 13 days later, how's that for a honeymoon? They were on a ship for Calcutta, India, sent by the Congregationalist denomination. But on the boat, you can imagine 5-6 months of riding on a boat. You have a lot of time. So you might as well read the Bible, right? And so that's what they did. And they came to the conclusion through all this reading, I think the Congregationalists and their sprinkling of infants for baptism is not correct. And so they converted to Baptist on the boat ride over, which the Baptists were very happy about when they landed there, but the Congregationalists had to drop their support because they were no longer Congregationalists. So they met up with William Carey and his buddies, and they were baptized by immersion by one of William Carey's missionaries in Serampore, India. So news spread back. The Congregationalists were mad, but they got support from the Baptists, so they continued on anyway. Adoniram had always wanted to go to Burma, but he was very afraid because there were some really bad stories of harsh treatment of foreigners. And so they went to India, but they ended up getting harassed by the East India Company there. And so they decided, well, we're already getting harassed. We might as well go where we want to go. So they set sail for Burma. So on the ship, sadly, his wife, Anne, delivered a stillbirth child and was bedridden for much of the first period when they landed there. And unlike India, which had some European community there, Burma was very raw, untouched by Western society. A few missionaries had come and gone. They didn't stay long, and they didn't overlap much while they were there. And so it didn't take long before the Judsons were the only missionaries in all of Myanmar. Like most missionaries, they had to spend about 12 hours a day in language study, just starting off, before they could really do anything. Judson proclaimed that the language was, quote, a continual sequence of letters with no punctuation or capitals and no division between words or sentences or paragraphs. That's not good. Evangelism was particularly difficult at first because the Burmese had no concept of an eternal God. They had no omnipotent God. It was just a barrier that they'd not been exposed to monotheism at all. And so, Burma was home to a version of Buddhism, complete with idol worship and trips to the large pagoda temples. So soon another missionary couple arrived, and he was a printer. This was great because Judson was writing, and they were able to start disseminating some portions of what he translated. So it was like, hey, I think I got John chapter 3. Let's translate it. All right, print it, send it. And they would just send out little pieces of what they could get at a time until they could get the whole thing done many years later. And so the government was a little bit weird because there would be times when they'd be fine and they would be able to share publicly, and then there would be times when they would decide to crack down. And so they never knew how open they could be about it. Adoniram began to grow very weary of the slow pace and no converts that had happened so far. And so he decided to try something different. The Buddhists had these little roadside temples, and they were sort of like, little meeting houses for traveling Buddhist priests to come and give just sort of a daily teaching. They would gather up a few of the local people, and it would be sort of like your lesson for the day from the traveling Buddhist priest. And they had these on the roadsides. Well, they were on a very well-traveled road, and Judson thought to myself, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to watch how they deliver, copy their mannerisms, except I'm going to go in there and share the gospel. And so that's what he did. 1 month later, after starting this, in front of a packed house, the first convert named Mang Nao trusted in Christ. Soon there were 10 baptized members, and he had his young church that had started. The converts quickly joined the Judsons in evangelism. They were excited. They were on board. Even when they would travel and go away, they would still meet and gather, and they were involved in evangelism. And with this success, though, came hardship. This is the beginning of the tough period. So Adoniram and Anne had lost their youngest son, Roger, who was just 6 months old, to tropical fever. Anne also became sick and took a sick leave to America to recover. At the time she returned, there had broken out war between England, and Burma. And so any white men were suspected to be spies and immediately thrown in prison. And that included Adoniram. So the Burmese prison conditions were terrible. Adoniram was placed in the general population beside criminals. It was dark, wet, rat-infested. The guards would shackle his feet, tie it to a rope, and every night when it was time to sleep, they would hoist the bottom half of your body up in the air so that the blood would rush to your head. And only your neck and upper back were resting on the ground. It was a terrible torture that they did. The guys never got sleep. They woke up completely numb. And so Am was constantly coming back and forth and trying to appeal this. Hey, he's an American citizen. This isn't right. He has nothing to do with England, and to no avail. And to make matters worse, she came back and said that she had become pregnant from just apparently when he left. So she was 8 months pregnant, and she arrived holding a new baby named Maria. And so at that time, a British attack happened, and they decided to move the Burmese prison a long way inland. And this was basically a death march, because you think about it, these guys were completely out of shape. It had been a year. They hadn't let them outside to walk at all. And so they marched them miles into the jungle. Several died on the way. Adoniram wrote as he crossed a tall bridge with his feet completely, the skin was gone, he was bleeding. He thought, I might just jump off of this bridge right now. It just ended because the pain is so bad. Anne came to the new prison. She visited, she continued to work on his behalf, and she brought baby Maria. She continued to get sick, though. She got so sick that she would actually have to allow Maria to be nursed by local Burmese women because she was so sick she couldn't even nurse her child. After a year and a half of prison, Adoniram was released with the stipulation that he would help the Burmese translate a negotiation with the British. And so he was in the capital, which is Rangoon, fulfilling his role, and he received a letter. Ann Judson had passed away of tropical fever. And a few months later, another letter that baby Maria had also passed away. Adoniram blamed himself. He said he should have been there, and he went into a deep, dark depression. He threw himself into an unsustainable pace of translating work on the Bible, and then he isolated himself completely. He didn't want to see or talk to anyone, even the other missionaries. He went into the jungle. He built a small hut for himself, and he lived as a recluse. He dug a small grave and laid by it for many days, hoping that he could die and roll into the grave. But the missionaries, the Burmese local Christians, would send groups out to him in the jungle. They would bring him food. They would come and pray for him. And over time, it didn't happen in a day. Over time, he was restored, and he came back and joined everyone else. And he said he had, this had started a new passion in his heart. He had a new spirit after all of this hardship. He wrote of himself, I sometimes feel alarmed like a person that sees a mighty engine beginning to move over which he knows he has no control. And so he set a goal of 25 Bible verses translated per day until he completed the Bible. 14 years after the death of Anne in 1840, he sent the final page to the printer. It was complete. Adoniram did remarry. He met a widow of another missionary whose husband had died. Her name was Sarah Boardman. They were married for 10 years, and he was able to have 6 children with Sarah in 10 years. And in 1845, they decided to go visit the United States, and they brought 3 of their children with them. It had been 33 years since Judson had been home. Sadly, on the journey, his wife passed away. Sarah died on the journey to the United States. Well, when he arrived there, he was surprised to see he was a celebrity. It was kind of like that moment in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, where they wrote the hit song and they didn't know it. And then they show up and everyone knows their song. Missions fever had struck the Baptist churches in America. Everyone was talking about missions, and everyone knew Adoniram Judson's name. And so he was on a constant speaking schedule. He was the most desired speaker in all of the churches of America. And so in one of the churches, he met another woman who was a gifted fiction writer. They immediately fell in love. Her name was Emily. And Emily was a great writer, and we know about Adoniram Judson today because of her writings. She was the one that recorded most of his writings. And so she went back with him to Burma. 3 years later, it was 1850, Adoniram became ill and left on a ship for treatment, and he would die on that ship at sea. Emily took the Judson sons by Sarah and then one of her own back to the USA for life in Boston. And because of complications, she would die 3 years later from those health complications. And so Adoniram Judson's legacy would be the Burmese Bible and the unique fact that the local Burmese people owned the mission that he started and multiplied it long after he was gone. That was something that William Carey never saw. There was a growth that happened in Burma that just was unique, and the locals owned it, and they took ownership of it, and they came to love Adoniram even after he was gone. His work really stands as an anomaly in the Buddhist world. In Southeast Asia, I mean, you can look, there's nothing like that. There's no pocket. It's just a strange, if you were to look at a religious map, there's this strange Baptist pocket that stands in Myanmar, and it's because of the work of Adoniram Judson and what he did. So the story of Adoniram Judson is one of much toil and of much sowing. And really, that's a picture of the Christian life. Maybe we don't endure the hardships. I hope none of us endure those hardships that he did. But the fundamental truth is that the work of a Christian is that of a patient sower. So now I want to move into our application time as we look at the scriptures. And I kind of learned from myself last week. I felt like 3 points was a little too heavy after a biography. So you just get 1 point today. One main idea that I'm going to hammer home, and that's going to be it for us. So what I want to share with you in the time remaining is that when we understand the work of a missionary is tied to patient sowing and reaping, we will have a better grasp of God's will to work through us. And when we understand the work of sowing, we are less likely to lose heart in Jesus. Because if we don't grow weary, we will see the works of God through us. And so I'm going to ask you to turn to Galatians 6. Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 through 9, as we explore this concept of the missionary and sowing. You can see I'm kind of setting up a theme here. Last week was the missionary mindset. This week, the missionary and sowing. So we're going to continue this theme on. So now I'm going to read Galatians 6, 7 through 9 for you. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that he will also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So today I want to give you one main idea, which the missionary sows and reaps. So the missionary sows and reaps in patience. In patience. The last time I went to India and met with our missionary Jeff, he apparently had been reading Galatians because there was one verse that he quoted to me probably 5 times in the duration of our trip, and it was Galatians 6:9. He said, let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. He said it over and over and over again. And so here's the context of those 3 verses together. There's an immutable, unchangeable law that God has built into creation, that you reap what you sow. I don't think anyone can deny that that's true. This is mentioned several times throughout the scriptures in several different ways. If you work harder, generally, you can earn more. If you are mean to people, generally, you will have fewer friends. If you entertain addictive things, generally, you are at more risk for becoming addicted to things. If you spend money like you don't have and you can't sustain, generally, you will go into debt and be broke. Generally, you reap the things that you sow, right? This is undeniable. It's true in farming. If you sow an apple seed, you get an apple tree, right? You reap what you sow, okay? But here's the hard part for us as Christians in our sowing of the gospel into the world around us. It's not as easy to measure and predict as those other areas of sowing. The gospel is just not that easy to measure and predict. It's sort of unpredictable. I don't know, because I think Jesus said, didn't he say the Spirit is like the wind? He blows where he wishes. And so in farming, you plant based upon seed and soil. You know each crop has its season. You know the weather patterns that are generally predictable throughout the year. Barring random cold fronts or plagues of locusts, you generally know from the moment you plant the seed how long it's going to be till you see the harvest, right? There are other areas in life, this is sort of similar, maybe in the stock market, unless you're just a a risk-taking day trader, generally you can follow the rate of return on any given stock and know what's going to happen. Of course, there's crashes from time to time, but generally, if you follow the main trends, you know what's going to happen. Spiritual sowing of the gospel is much more volatile. It's more difficult to predict. Every person is different. Every person has a different backstory and history. Every region is different. Every country is different. Every continent is different. The same gospel seed is received differently into different soils. I think there's a story about that. Oh wait, here it is. Jesus affirmed this in the parable of the sower. He said, a sower went out to sow and threw seed indiscriminately on the ground. Some seed fell on the dirt road. It wasn't received at all. Bounced, nothing. Some fell into thin, rocky soil. It grew, sprouted up real quick, but there was no roots. There was no depth. It died as soon as the sun came out. Some fell into soil that had weeds and thorns all around it. And so a plant did grow, but eventually the little flower was just choked out by the thorns. And finally, some seed fell on good soil. It grew. It produced a crop over and over and over again. I'm sure you've heard this parable, but maybe you haven't thought about it in real life and what it means. Think about our world today. Think about where Christianity flourishes compared to where it doesn't. I think this parable proves itself. So here's just a few examples. If we just look at the last century of history, the gospel has taken different root in different soils. So what we call now the global south of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and South America are some of the most receptive gospel fields the world has ever seen in the past 100 years. It's no doubt this is good soil. And we've seen some similar things in China, incredible growth in China. We're about to find out what happens when the government cracks down, because they're about to there. And America continues to hold on, despite what you might hear, that Christianity is dying in America. I would say, from what I can tell, nominal Christianity is dying in America. Liberal Christianity is dying in America. But actual biblical Christianity is holding about the same rate and maybe even growing slightly. Don't worry too much. It's just burning off the old dead leaves, okay? But generally, this has been good soil, right? It's been pretty good soil here. Europe was once the stronghold of Christianity, but no longer is that true. Places where the reformers and great heroes once walked, we now see Christianity drawn into numbers dangerously close to unreached people groups. Germany and England and France are now receiving missionaries rather than sending missionaries. Perhaps this is an example of the rocky soil, where it shot up for a time and then died away. What about the Middle East? The people seem to be receptive and hungry. Every time they get a chance to hear the gospel, they're very excited for it, but the threat of Islam has stamped out Christianity there. And it's very costly to come to faith. I would say this is an example of the weed-infested and thorn-infested soil. And then there are areas that, for one reason or another, it just seems like that seed bounces right off the road. Until I went to India and saw it myself, India has basically been that. It's not been receptive to the gospel. I mean, they've never, ever cracked 2% Christian in their population, despite all the work that's been done there. Japan has always struggled to receive the gospel. Russia has never been a fruitful field. And so, do missionaries still go there and labor? Yes, they do. But what if the plowing and tilling of today's work is what takes to lead to that harvest of tomorrow? It's worth it to many missionaries to go and do that, to go to a place where they may never see anything. I mean, I've talked to missionaries that have seen less than 10 converts in their entire time being somewhere. Probably the case in China is that we're now reaping harvest of years gone by, of somebody struggled for a long time. That was some hard ground. There was nothing in China, nothing. And then all of a sudden, through the time of Hudson Taylor, and then after, things began to change. They became receptive. But somebody had to go and break up the rocks. Somebody had to go be the shovel head and smash their head into the soil over and over to get it done. That's probably somewhat true about this area in Colorado. I would say it's difficult, and that may be what we're doing, is smashing head against the soil. And we may not get the great grand seeding of the harvest But most people, most missionaries, as you study, they don't see the whole process. Most missionaries rarely see from plowing, tilling, seed sowing, watering, and reaping. Few people in their whole life ever see that whole process. Often you just see one or two of those in that chain. And this is why I say the missionary, meaning you and me, not missionaries, but missionaries. You and I must sow and reap in patience. Only God knows the stage of the crop cycle or the quality of the soil. We can make our best missional guesses about what soil we live in, but we really don't know. Listen again to what Paul says in verse 9. Let us not grow weary in doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. Let's just look at those words. Let us not grow weary. Well, that simply means don't let discouragement overtake you. It could be translated in other places, don't lose heart. Don't get to a defeated point where you give up. Well, what are we not to grow weary in? In doing good. Now, Paul doesn't mean generic good. He means, if you look at verse 8, he talks about sowing to the Spirit. I love that phrase. You don't hear that phrase very often. Sowing spiritual things. That can mean serving Jesus in life. That can mean our evangelistic work of the gospel. But do not grow weary in sowing to the Spirit. I think it's a good time to stop and ask, have you grown weary in sowing things of the Spirit? Are you discouraged in sowing spiritual things? Think about it. Paul's telling you a very spiritual response. Stop that. Don't do that. Now why? Because he says, in due season, we will reap. At the proper time, at the unique moment, the reaping will come. Well, when is that? In due season. Well, what's due season? Well, that's the tension. That's the whole tension of the Christian service. The reason people give up. How do you know? How do you know that that's the tension? Well, because he says, if we do not give up, right after that. So that must mean people are likely to give up. It's a common thing to give up because due season doesn't come. But here's the promise. Reaping comes one way or the other. Maybe God allows us to see and experience the promised land in our lives. Like Joshua. He got to cross over. He got to fight a little bit. He got to see it and live in it. But maybe you're Moses. You get right up to the goalpost and you can't cross the goal line. You don't know. You don't know. Sometimes we're not going to be able to see the work until we get to heaven and see those that we've affected. There's a really, I hate to say it, I've made fun of this song before. It's not a bad song. I make fun of things. So there's this old song by Ray Boltz that I have made fun of called Thank You for Giving to the Lord. Anybody? It's a corny song. But there's a really good message in it. There's a really good message in this song. So it's one of those old story songs. And a man dies thinking that he hasn't made any difference in his life for Christ. And so he gets to heaven. And when he gets there, he's greeted by a series of people that say, you didn't know it, but when you taught at Sunday school that I was an 8-year-old and I came to faith later and you didn't know it, but it was because of you. And you didn't know it when you gave to missions. You never saw where that money went, but it went to me in this country, and I was saved because of your work and your giving. And so the whole song was, thank you for giving to the Lord. And, I think a lot of times that's a message we need to see, is that we're not always knowing the results of the seeds that we sow. And it's this long, patient view of sowing the gospel that allows us not to grow weary. The basis of our labors is not in the results. It's in that we do not grow weary and we do not give up. Let me say that a different way. God doesn't care as much about the results as he cares about whether or not you give up. You might say, well, I'm already there. I've already given up. It's too late. Well, you may be legitimately discouraged. I know some of us are. But you're probably not build a hut in the Burmese jungle, live alone, sleep by a grave you dug for yourself so that you can roll in and die discouraged. Right? You're probably not there. Adoniram Judson recovered. That's why I tell you this story. He recovered from that. He was standing on a bridge and he thought, I should just jump off of this thing and end it now. He was sleeping by a grave he dug for himself, and yet some of the most fruitful ministry of his life happened after that moment. So let's call it what it is. Ministry in Colorado is difficult. It's discouraging. People are spiritual, as long as spiritual means a combination of you do you, with a pinch of grab bag Buddhism, with a dash of generic Osteen encouragement, stirred with the spoon of what programs can your church provide for my family. Right? Somebody can amen that, I'm sure. We are the cogs. We are the inner workings, the springs of a culture change that must occur in this area. Because this area craves junk food, but they don't know it's junk food. They rot their teeth out on cotton candy, but they don't look in the mirror of God's word to see that it's causing cavities. It's a horrible cycle, actually. Spiritually interested people go to a church that gives them a message that their unregenerate heart will appreciate, so therefore they stay and continue to hear messages that will keep them unregenerate, building up an intolerance to the actual gospel when they hear it. Every missionary has their cross to bear. William Carey battled Hinduism, East India Company, Adoniram Judson battled Buddhism and a government that imprisoned him. Both battled sickness, both battled the loss of family. I don't want to make light of our struggle here, but it is not as bad as that. It is not. Our cross to bear is nothing compared to what they endured. We live in an expensive area. Yes, that's a challenge. We live in an area that is fast liberalizing. Yes, that's a challenge. Maybe our biggest challenge is one day we'll be free the nipple. But that's not the biggest challenge the world has ever seen, right? There's worse stuff out there, okay? And people, yes, have just enough church knowledge to think that they know what Jesus has to offer, and that's challenging because you can say, well, it's easier because, Judson went in and they didn't know anything, and so he was the first time they heard Christianity. Okay, maybe fair. Yes, there weren't other churches down the road that were competing with false messages. Yes, okay, fair. But I can only encourage us with the words of Scripture in this. And I go back over and over because you should memorize this verse. Verse 9 says, let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap, if we do not give up. That's good. That's a good verse. It just strike. When I read that this week, it was just a shot in the heart right there. And listen, I cannot tell you what is due season. I can't. That is a variable in the algebraic equation for which I cannot solve. But if you look at verse 9 as an algebraic equation, you kind of picture equals reaping, okay? That's on one side. And then you sort of got, your x plus y plus z equals reaping, okay? Well, one of those things we'll never find out. One of those variables, let's call it z. It is due season. You don't know it. You can't. It's a variable that you cannot fix. But there are other variables in this equation that we can control. One of them, do not grow weary. Can you control that? Generally speaking, doing good. Can you control that? Do not give up. Can you control that? So the only thing we can't control is the meaning of due season. Are there times when you have to change course? Yes, sure. If you remember, there was a time when Adoniram Judson decided, hey, me walking around town and just being a vagabond street preacher is not working. I'm going to go into this Buddhist temple and share. That was a change, sure. There was a time when Paul was going to go to Asia, but then he received the Macedonian call and went to Philippi. William Carey started in the interior of India, saw 0 converts for 7 years. As soon as he moved into Danish-controlled Calcutta, all of a sudden the floodgates broke open. When the disciples were out fishing with the boat all night and caught nothing, Jesus showed up and told them, just cast on the other side. Put your net on the other side. Bada boom, lots of fish, okay? So, here's a great tension that I cannot reconcile for you, but I got to give it to you. Sometimes the winner is the one who never gives up and changes course. And then eventually the dam breaks and everyone says it's because they persevered that they were successful. Other times, sometimes the winner is the one who calls an audible and makes the change. And then the dam breaks and everything changes. And then they are celebrated because they knew when to make the right change. So, what is the missionary to do? What are we to do as Christians who sow the gospel in this city? I think we focus on the things we can control. Our effort and our attitude. Don't grow weary, do good, don't give up. It's right out of verse 9. Don't grow weary, do good, don't give up. Don't grow weary, do good, don't give up. And we remain close to the Lord, because I think Paul wouldn't have heard the Macedonian call had he not been close to the Lord. We remain close to the Lord, and should he change something, we'll know it because we're close to him. Patience, it's not only a virtue. People say that, and I want to say, it's really a fruit of the Spirit. Patience is a fruit of the Spirit. We are to be patient in our labors for Jesus. Patience reveals, here's why it's a fruit of the Spirit, and it's not just a virtue. Patience reveals that we cannot strong-arm our way to our own plans, but that we must wait upon the Lord. That sounds almost biblical. Wait upon the Lord. How many times is that in the Psalms? The Lord, he is the source of our success. Though we labor, he gives the increase. As much as we may want to shake the tree branches, come off you darn fruit, and shake the tree branches and just curse the apples for not falling, we must say that the Lord is the one who will allow us to reap in due season. There's an old farmer phrase, and I admit I'm not farming, so maybe you can ask Ken if this is true, but nothing good grows overnight. Nothing good grows overnight. Think about that. We know this to be true, unless you really like weeds or those little mushroom caps that just show up on your yard randomly. I know some of you like to go out and kick them like a football, and it's really fun for you, but typically, nothing good grows overnight. I'm from Florida, where oranges grow. From an orange seed to a fruit-bearing tree, it takes 7 years to see an orange. To go from a seed to an orange tree that's producing edible oranges. It takes patience to see something good grow. And anything that sprouts up overnight, chances are it's infested with weeds. Do not lose heart in serving Jesus. Do not grow weary. If we do not give up, we will reap. Now, maybe the Lord is laying an area on your heart. Maybe there's a seed that you've planted in the past. You got discouraged and you walked away and you left it as a seedling. I know I have those areas in my life. Would you ask the Lord today if he would have you revisit some of those areas that you've walked away from? Maybe the Spirit's laying on your heart a new field, a place that you have not sown any seed before, that you would begin the work of sowing there. Maybe there's an area where you have seen some growth, but you've never had a conversation about reaping. There does come a time when you pluck the fruit off of the branch, and sometimes we just talk to the fruit and hope that it falls off, but sometimes you need to pluck. Maybe there's relationships in your life that you've had those gospel conversations and you have invested, and you've never actually said, hey, do you think you want to follow Jesus today, like right now? We can do that today. Maybe you have to have some of those moments. I don't know what the Lord is laying on your heart, but I know this. The Christian life is one of patience and sowing. May we not lose heart as we continue our work for him. Continue sowing. Pray that you might reap. Pray that due season would come. But most of all, do not grow weary in doing good, and sow to the Spirit. Pray with me.